Tonight's presentation on effective Lutheran school boards and board member orientation. I'm here with Bill Cochran, former director of school ministry for Lutheran schools. Bill also former principal at several different schools, Good Shepherd in Collinsville, Christ Community in St. Louis, former director of schools for the Eastern District.
That's correct.
Multiple National Lutheran School accreditation visits as captain, consultant, and team member. Probably too many to even list.
Probably.
So we are very blessed to have Bill with us tonight to talk about effective Lutheran school boards. Bill has done this with his role as principal and working with boards and organizing boards. He's done a lot of it as director of schools for the Eastern District, and then even more as director of schools for the LCMS. So it's a great joy, always a pleasure of mine to have Bill talk on a variety of topics and to be with us. In tonight's session, I will certainly field any questions, so anyone that has any, feel free to type in the chat box again or unmute and you can chime in. Bill and I are happy to field those. It'll be some back and forth dialogue. I will ask Bill some questions about boards, effective boards, his experiences with boards and all the different positions that he has held. And we might go through some PowerPoint slides so you see on your screen the PowerPoint. You should have this shared image of the title of the presentation. And from time to time, we might slide that along depending on the flow of tonight's activity. To get to some certain slides. So with that, we will go ahead and make use of the next hour to get going and discuss effective Lutheran boards. The first, well, unless you have anything you want to chime in on initially, Bill.
No, I'll wait till you ask me a question.
All right, then I'll already start. I'll ask you the first question, which is the all-encompassing one right away. What makes an effective Lutheran school board of education, or however they want to title it, because different schools title it different ways. Some school board, some board of education, there's many titles.
Well, effective school boards have several roles, but their main role is to develop policy. There's a difference between developing policy and carrying out policy. The principal is usually the person that relates to the board, and the board tells the principal what the policies are. And then it's up to the principal then and his staff to develop procedures to handle those policies. So that the main job that a board has is to develop policies that the school can run effectively. I think effective school boards are also ones that pray about and care about the school. They're ones that do a strategic plan, like what's the school going to look like in the next 3 to 5 years. They are very concerned about the financial success of the school and its operation. Now that varies depending on if the school has its own budget or it's a unified budget with the church. But there's still a role that the board has in dealing with that as far as the finances go. And then to be supportive of the school and its programs. The board, an effective board is not there to deal with day-to-day issues. That's the job of the principal and the faculty and the other people on the staff that when issues come up.
Now, and I would maybe expand on that a little bit, Bill, because what you have seen in the past, one of my experiences all the time is that there's conflict between board and principal because of a board that desires to come in and be involved in procedures, that we want to try to operate the school. And a misunderstanding, perhaps, maybe just not an awareness as a board or board member, the role of what it means to have policy and to empower a principal to carry out policy and procedures, which is really what a principal is doing, are all the procedures and the day-to-day operations, with a board who comes in and says, you know, I'm a board member because I don't like our athletic program, or what are we doing about our academics? They're not good enough. Or this teacher over here, we need to do something about the teacher.
Well, certainly those are issues that a lot of schools face. I think that's why it's important to have these kind of trainings so that board members understand. And I know in a lot of places in the United States where we have Lutheran schools, there are very key people that have major control in a congregation and want to do things the way the way they want it done. But that's not being an effective board member. And I think that we just have to continue to educate. And I think the principal needs to make sure that there is board education every year when new board members come on. And I think it's important for the principal and the chairman to be meeting on a regular basis prior to each board meeting to actually lay out what's happening.
I would agree. In fact, I think it's incredibly important that board training occurs every year. You know, some schools will say, oh, well, we had board training 2 years ago, so we're good for a while. But every year, it's great to have board training and kind of renew the concept of policy versus procedure, the role of the board versus the role of the principal, and the crossover then of the principal being in charge of operations. I'm just going to take 1 second. Nathaniel, can you give me a thumbs up if we're okay on audio and video? So excellent. I was like doing that kind of at this point, just to make sure we're still in good shape. Bill, I know you've seen this and dealt with it, and it happens. It always happens. What do you do when there is conflicts? Conflict board member to board member, conflict board member and principal, or what if the board oversteps its bounds and has a conflict with a parent or a teacher? I'm sure you've seen it, right?
I've seen it. I've seen it a lot of times.
Yes.
But I think that's where a clear policy manual being in place and the board following those policies and looking at them on a regular basis to see if they're still applicable. I think if the board and the principal are having a problem, that almost has to have an outsider like in district ed exec or somebody from the district come in and mediate that. Very seldom does that get taken care of by itself. If it's between a board member and a teacher, I think that's where the policy can deal with that. I'm a firm believer in a Matthew 18 policy to begin with, that if a parent has a problem with a teacher, they need to go to the teacher first, not the principal. Most of the time, the principal has no clue what went on during that time, so they can't address it. And usually what I've found out is if people are direct and follow the Matthew 18 principle, the problem gets resolved immediately. I'm also a firm believer in when something happens during the school day that involves a child, that child's going to go home and tell their parent a different story than what actually happened if they got in trouble. And I'm a firm believer in the teacher calling the parent immediately when they're disciplining a child for something that's major, and let the child explain to the parent what actually happened with the teacher standing there. And then they'll usually tell the truth and it won't get blown out of proportion. As far as board members against board members, that's probably where maybe the pastor has to get involved, or I have seen it in schools where they had to bring in the caring team, that team out of Utah.
Yeah, ambassadors
for reconciliation. In fact, I worked with a school a couple of years ago where that was going on big time.
Yeah. And, you know, I think this, again, is where board training is so vitally important. And while you do it every year, I think it's proactive to head off some of those conflicts. When you have board training and you engage the board in what their role is and what their responsibilities are, and you give them a job description as a board member as well, it should proactively eliminate some of these situations and some of the conflict, because they understand the role as a board member, they understand the role of principal, they understand that it's not their function to oversee teachers and to do evaluations. and get involved at that level. Instead, one of the things I always talk about is that boards should be futuristic. They should be 75% of a board meeting should be looking down the road, and the other 25%, okay, you're dealing with some reports and some issues. So what should a board focus on, and what becomes futuristic besides day to day?
Well, I think that probably every congregation and or school should have some kind of a strategic plan in place where they're looking at what the future is going to hold. And the schools, depending on how healthy they are, they're dealing with issues that are going to change each year based on what the enrollment in kindergarten is, what the enrollment in the 8th grade is, where we're going to go with whatever. So I think the board should be taking a look at those kind of things. I think the board actually should be looking out for the welfare and success of the school. So in other words, the marketing aspect, the positive public relations that go out, the building up of the teachers and the principal for that matter, are the most important things they should be doing.
Yeah, and that brings up kind of two topics for me to ask you about. One, you should be able to see on your screen Lutheran Elementary School's opportunities and challenges. Bill, I stole this from an article that you wrote for Concordia University, Nebraska.
Okay.
And it was published many years ago, but I still pull it out all the time because to me, it says, futuristic speaking, what should a board be looking at? And what should a principal, I always think a principal in the board meeting, you talk about the other 25% of the time. I talk about dashboards. What are the important topics that a principal should be informing the board about? Just like the dashboard of your car where you have your speed limit, your oil, your tire pressure, everything else, those important things, make sure your car is running and in good shape. And when one of those indicator lights comes on, you better pay attention to it. So I always talk about, a document like this. Here's your dashboard. And if one of those things you're having a struggle with, that's your indicator light, you should be spending some time on it. So with that and pulling it out, kind of bringing you back to what you did way back when, how would you see that as a board and a principal working together on these 9 items to develop the future of the school and make sure that it's sustainable? One of the greatest problems we have with Lutheran schools today, in my opinion, is we focus on today.
Right.
And we forget we should be developing, like you said, a strategic plan and looking down the road and developing not just tomorrow, but the tomorrow after tomorrow after tomorrow.
I think one of the most important points on there is the mission, purpose, vision. So in other words, what kind of school do we really want to be? What's our mission here? What are we going to do to do that? I used to get a little excitement out of Concordia, Peoria, Illinois. They had probably the best grade school band in the 70s and 80s of anywhere in the country. They marched in parades all over the country, and that's what that school was known for. There's other schools that are known for their athletics, and there's other schools that are known for their academics. But what's our mission going to be? Ross Stieber, who was a former associate director of schools, when I was talking to him about what makes a high school a good high school, he said, what is your niche going to be? In other words, what are you going to be able to focus on and be known for? So we might, like Lutheran North in St. Louis, they're right now known for football. And they have been for the last 3 or 4 years, but they have other things that are going on as well. I think another part of that is your teachers and how effective are your teachers? Are you observing your teachers? Is there a plan to help teachers become the best teachers they can be? A number of years ago, we had a principal in St. Louis who wanted to meet with me all the time and talk to me about his 4-point plan and how his school was going to become the best school in the Synod. And so I watched him develop that 4-point plan over the number of years that it took. And he actually was able to do that. He got teachers on board that would follow the plan. He had activities set up that the teachers would get involved in. When technology was becoming more and more of a thing that's used in schools, he would have faculty meetings where the teachers would present how they're using that technology in their classroom. So those are important things. I think academic excellence we always want to focus on, but your school is only as strong as your weakest teacher. So you want to make sure that you've got your teachers on board. The finance thing is always an issue. But what are we doing to become financially successful? How are we dealing with our empty seats? Are we able to fill those? Do we have some kind of a plan for that? So those are the kind of things that I think a board can be looking at outside of the fact that the floors in the school aren't clean all the time. That's not their issue. The principal will deal with that with whoever's in charge of the floor.
Well, and I know one of the things I talk with boards a lot when I go out and do board training is the principal will bring to you the fact that they are doing evaluations of teachers. And all you want to know as a board is that the principal is successfully going out and they've observed every teacher, hopefully twice a year. And they've done that. And when boards, I always say as a board, you're crossing the line when you want to know how each teacher is doing.
That's correct.
Instead, that's not the question. The question is, have you as a principal been out there and doing it? And then the question that you as a principal bring to the board is there a red light issue? Is there a teacher that is having a struggle? Maybe you need to put on a performance improvement plan or something like that. But that's where the issue stays. The board, however, should be evaluating the principal.
That's correct.
And that is, again, to me, where some of this breaks down. You know, these items that I think are great, that really do point to an effective Lutheran school. You see those pathways up there. I don't think boards understand how to evaluate a principal effectively. How do boards evaluate?
Well, a principal should be evaluated effectively on what your job description is for him.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, what are you expecting this principal to do? When you hire a principal, or if you are a board that comes in and there's a principal there, you want to make sure you have a job description. In that job description, it's going to talk about the things that the principal is supposed to be focusing on. Some things are more important than other things. And there should be a policy for almost each one of those areas that you want the principal to be focusing on. So observation of teachers is one small thing, but how are we marketing? How are we recruiting? How are we doing all of these different kinds of things? And I think there needs to be a job description which states that. So in other words, the grass isn't mowed every week and you rate the principal low on that, but you never told him or her that was part of the job description. Yeah. So I think that's an important thing.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, that's one of the topics I talk a lot about is the evaluation instrument should match up to the job description.
That's correct.
And that to me is the playing field. The principal always needs to know the playing field, just like a principal needs to talk with the educators, what their playing field is. And again, a job description for an educator that you match up their evaluation with, so they all know. And you hit on something else that I think is an issue, and that is when a board evaluates a principal, sometimes they're evaluating, but they're never talking to the principal, and they're never going over the evaluation to discuss, okay, well, let's have your mid-year evaluation. So it's January, we've been in a semester, let's sit down and talk about where you are. And instead, you get to the end of the year and they say, we had real struggles here. Well, why didn't you do this and why didn't you do that? And then the principal will come back and say, well, why didn't you tell me? So I could fix it.
I think there's a couple ways that you can help the principal out, and that is to do some surveys with teachers, maybe with students, maybe not, but also with parents.
Yeah.
That you're not evaluating the principal through those surveys, but you're asking questions about the important things that you're expecting for your school. A lot of times, areas where principals get hung up on is that they're not very good communicators with their teachers or parents. So what's the policy or the outcome that you say you want the teacher to be able, or the principal to be able to do? So I've seen that where communication is a big one.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
There's a whole other program we could do on what means to be a good principal, but
We'll do that one next time.
yeah, but I think for boards, to have that job description, to have your policies in place that you expect the principal to carry out, that's what you evaluate the principal on.
Yeah, and I think you hit on the other key item, and that is communication. It's got to be a two-way street, and you need to have the communication. Principal and board chair should be in a lot of communication because you should be developing the agenda together, and you should also, the old saying is very, very true. Never let your board be caught off guard if you're principal, and if you're the board, never let your principal be caught off guard.
That's correct.
So you have to have those lines of communication.
I've always been a believer when I was a principal and when I've worked with schools is that you should develop the agenda for the board a week or two ahead of the board meeting. And those things that are on the agenda are the things that you should be talking about in the board meeting. If something isn't on the agenda, unless it's in a real emergency type of a thing that you had no control over, that should not be discussed. So, and I think when the principal and the board chair meet regularly, they can come up with a board agenda. I'm also a firm believer that if a board meeting goes longer than an hour and a half, it's gone too long. Because otherwise you're spending too much time in the weeds and not enough time dealing with what's there. And I do think every principal should have a written board report based on what the policies he's supposed to be or she's supposed to be carrying out.
I agree. In fact, you talk about the board. I'm going to go back to share here if I can. You talk about the board meeting and the agenda being done ahead of time. What I always suggest when I go out and I do board trainings is that you should utilize the Harvard Business Review model for a board meeting. It has it at 90 minutes. It has your topic in one column. It has the person that's responsible for introducing that topic in the middle column. And then on the right-hand column, it has the number of minutes that you've assigned for that topic.
Right.
And then let's say that, let's say mowing the grass is the topic one, and Bill Cochran's going to bring it up in the meeting, and we assign 5 minutes to that. 5 minutes is up, but we haven't fully discussed the topic. There are still some things. What I always say then is you have to make a decision as a board. You have to have a vote to decide, are you going to continue beyond that 5 minutes, or are you done? So if the vote fails to continue it, you're on to the next item. If you vote to continue it for another 5 minutes, then something else is going to get cut by 5 minutes. But you keep the meeting to 90 minutes in length, and that's it.
One example of something that could cause, well, you could prepare for it, but when you're calling teachers, that could cause a board meeting to go a little longer, but you know that. Mm-hmm. But I developed a plan when I was calling, and I was calling at least 1 to 2 teachers every year when I was principal at Good Shepherd, because we were growing so fast. I went out and I would interview all the candidates that we were going to look at, videotaping them. And then I would pass the videotape around prior to the board meeting for the board members to look at. And then when they got to the board meeting, we were pretty well ready to talk about and make a vote on and do it. Mm-hmm. So, but I think those are the kind of things with the Harvard model. I didn't go to Harvard, so I'm not that smart, but
you know the Harvard model. You knew it before Harvard knew it. You gave it to them.
But anyway, but I think that's the way you plan for those things, so that I know my daughter's a principal and they're going through a building program right now. And that takes a lot of time. Meeting with architects, meeting with donors and all of that. And she's in a place where they do policy-based governance. So they really don't have a school board. They just have one board that deals with everything. I've worked under policy-based governance, and I think it's very good if it's in an association situation. In a single church, I think there still needs to be a school board to run those kind of things by. But anyway, you got to plan your things out, budget the time for them, and deal with it.
Yeah. And I'll go back to something else you talked about, and that is kind of gauging the school from the perspective of parents and students. We always used to do a climate survey every year.
Right.
So we would survey our parents, we would survey our teachers, we would survey students, and we had just all kinds of questions. We kept it short enough where it wasn't cumbersome. I think we had about 35 questions that we would use. What it did is it gave us longitudinal information as well. So year in and year out, we kind of see, okay, are we improving over here? Are we keeping steady where we were high in this area? Have we dropped off somewhere, and why? And that became the basis of our faculty meetings. We would spend some time on that climate survey at the end of the school year to say, okay, as we get ready for next year, here are some of our goals out of that climate survey. And it also gave, some input to the board. At the end of the school year, I would always do a state of the school report to the board, which highlighted the major areas, and then also kind of gave a focus as we get ready, because you're always ready for the next school year. Here are some of the items that we're going to be preparing for in the summertime and gearing up for as our goals for the next school year. I would also encourage the board, as part of the evaluation process of the principal, to have the principal submit a professional growth plan.
Right. So
not only, here's my job description, but as part of that, here are my 2 to 3 goals for this school year that I'm going to work on. Everything from maybe attending a meeting or bringing a new program like the 4.1 that you talked about before, or something else. But how are you going to grow as a principal? And then part of that conversation is, as a board, how do we support you in that growth plan? Again, that brings engagement board to principal and board to school.
I did that also with teachers. So as a part of our strategic plan, what the goals, each teacher had to come up with at least 2 goals, one personal, one professional. And I met with every teacher before school started, asking them how I could help them, and they would report back to me on how they were accomplishing their goals. But one of their goals had to meet what the strategic plan was all about. And so then you can share that with your board, that you are following the strategic plan.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions I get when I go out and I do effective school board presentations, there are boards that when I talk with them, okay, so our role is to work with the principal. So we set policy, and we're 75% future oriented, and we're devising a strategic plan, and we're concentrating on that. But as a board, we want to be involved and engaged in the school. We want to know the teachers. How does a school board effectively engage with knowing the teachers, knowing the school, without overstepping the bounds of, now I'm interfering with the procedures, I'm overstepping and replacing the role of the principal, and I'm getting too much into everyday business of the school?
Well, one of the things that I did was, when the school year started, prior to the school year starting, I had a big banquet or barbecue or a picnic with the board and the teachers and the pastors, obviously, that were involved. Mm-hmm. So they get to know each other that way. When you're on a board, you're only a board member when the board's in session. Mm-hmm. So many of your board members are also parents, but they are not to be using their role as a board to listen to people complain. But I do think that it's important for boards to show up at activities that go on in the school. So in other words, if you're having a fall festival, the board members ought to be at that if they can be there. I think if there's a chance for any time to have a dinner or something with the board and the teachers, it always works well. Then they get to know each other. I'm not a real advocate of having a teacher go to a board meeting. They really don't have any role there. if they're doing that and the board wants them there, then the board is not necessarily looking at the principal as being their person. So I think it's okay if a teacher wanted to go to a board meeting once in a while just to see what goes on, but they really have no role there. They shouldn't be saying anything. The board should not be putting any pressure on them.
Yeah.
I like it better to have social activities where they can get to know each other as on a social activity.
Yeah, Bill and I are very much on the same page as that. I know there are times when boards will invite a faculty member to come in. They may even invite them to do a devotion or to be there for the meeting. To me, that kind of creates some blurred lines. It can create issues with what you're discussing. You know, you may have to say, well, we're going into executive session now to discuss something, and then you remove the teacher, and then it becomes, well, I wonder what they're talking about now. So I'm very much on board, and we used to do the same thing. You know, have a cookout. The board should be providing time, talent, and treasure. And sometimes, you know, you think treasure, well, I have to be a huge giver to the school of dollars, and that's not the case. The case being treasure is showing up, being at activities, being at fundraisers, being at games, finding possible donors, connecting you to people that are willing to provide gifts in kind. You know, if you're doing something, a project at school, and I know an architect or I know a construction worker over here, you know, line up the people, make those connections. So it's that connection process too.
I think the other side of that is that the principal needs to share with the faculty the board minutes. Usually if a board's going to have minutes that are not executive session type minutes, and those can be shared. And most people I know don't really care to read them anyway, but at least the principal has shared with them what went on in the board meeting.
As a principal, I think what you really need to do is, in that gap between board to teachers, create trust. And sharing the board minutes creates the trust that, look, we're here and the board is supporting the ministry. They want to be engaged in the ministry. I'm not saying things to the board that you can't hear. You know, of course, there's some things that are private in that matter, personnel issues, discipline issues, and other things. But for the most part, you know, it's look to create trust factor. And I think the trust factor comes out too when you have a cookout between board and faculty. You have board showing up at games and events. We always, you know, one of the first things we did to kick off the year, the president of our board would come to our beginning of the year worship service for our faculty, and would give a greeting and would talk to them and interact.
Yeah, those are the best ways for boards and faculty to relate. I also think it's important for the principal, though, to be a developer of his staff or her staff, so that your staff knows you care about them. They know that you want them to be successful. They will then turn that around to you to say, I believe what this person's telling me.
Yes.
And I think that's a two-way street.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you got to build credibility there.
That's another presentation. But
yeah, well, we can do that one too.
Yeah.
But I always tell the board, do little things from time to time. For instance, when you have a board meeting, pray for every teacher in your school. Then put a note in their box that we prayed for you tonight.
Right.
That's pretty powerful when you watch teachers come in the next morning and take that out of their mailbox and see a handwritten note from a board member signed with their name and addressed to them personally that we prayed for you. I mean, that's how you start to build these connections. And little things that you can come up with, I think, go a long way. So you hit on something else. This comes up all the time. You know, you're a board member when you're in a board meeting, but you're no longer a board member when you're outside the meeting. What do you do if you're a board member and you're at a football game and you're on the fence line, you're watching a football game and a parent comes up to you and says, you know, the board needs to handle this situation because this is going on. What are you going to do about it?
Well, again, that's a policy that I would have developed ahead of time, saying that if following the Matthew 18 policy, that if you have a problem with somebody, you need to go and talk to that person first. It's between you and that person. Most of the time, if they do that, they'll get the problem resolved and it won't even be a problem. So if I'm the board member standing at the fence and somebody comes to me, what I'm going to say to that person is, have you talked to that person about this issue? Most of the time they'll say no. And then I'm going to say, well, you need to do that. Then if there's still an issue, you need to go to the principal. Now, if it's the principal they're having a problem with, again, I still think they need to go to the Matthew 18. Then I usually would involve the pastor if there's a problem with the principal and another parent. Usually it doesn't get to that if you follow the Matthew 18 principle.
What happens if the board member goes the other route and says, absolutely, I'm going to handle this, and you've got a problem with this teacher, I'm going to go and bring that up at the next board meeting?
Well, the board chairman, unless it's the board chairman that's doing it, the board chairman should tell that board member that they're out of line and they're not going to discuss it, that the person that talked to you should talk to the person they're having the trouble with. I know that doesn't always work, and I know because we're human beings that we get involved in those, and then situations get out of hand, which really could have gotten settled with just a little bit of discussion. So I think it's up to the board chairman to get that out and meet. That's why you need to have a training every year, because every year you probably get new board members. Maybe every 5 years you get new board members, but you need to have that training every year to keep reinforcing those policies that we're not here to deal with the day-to-day problems.
You brought up another item, and I want to remember to hit on it here. The pastor. What is the pastor's role in the school and with the board, and making sure that the school board and the principal work effectively together? Is the pastor on the board? How does that happen?
Well, I think realistically, the pastor should be an ex officio member of the board. I think in order to be a good pastor, you need to be supportive of all your activities that go on in your church. And the school is one of those. Now, if you have a really big school and a big congregation, you're probably going to have more than one pastor. So one of the pastors could be assigned to be at the board meeting. But I do think it's important that a pastor is at the board meeting, not as a board member, but as an ex officio person. Just like if you have a church council, the principal may go to the church council as an ex officio member of the church council because they're the principal. Same way with the youth director, choir director, or whatever would be a part of those. But I do think that the pastor is the shepherd, and the pastor is the spiritual leader. And so in order to provide that spiritual leadership, they need to be supportive of the school. They need to be supportive of the board. And if they have issues, then they need to deal with those in the Matthew 18 way.
Very much so, yeah. You see, we did put up there a slide. This is not obviously all slide-based. It's more discussion-based here as we bring up different items that might impact being an effective school board. But board members, this is one I always like to use. Board members are not. They are not a school complaint line. They are not an advocate for special interests. So if your goal for being on the board is because you love drama and you want to see a great drama program, or that you very much dislike the curriculum, so you're going to be on there to change that, or that you want a great sports program, so that's going to be me representing that. I always say you're not like Congress in that sense. You're not a special interest representative. Instead, you are a representative for the entire ministry.
I think your yellow box there with the one voice is very important, because you will have votes that take place in the board meeting. And let's say you would have 7 members. I think 7 is probably about as many as you should have on a board. You could have less, but if 6 vote yes and 1 votes no, the vote is a yes. So the one that voted no shouldn't be out explaining, well, I voted no on this. But when the board does something, they do it as one unit. And that's the way it should be portrayed. That, again, is helpful to get that out in a training. ahead of time, so that when those issues come up, and they might not come up until March, and then I've forgotten, or I don't think about what's right and what's wrong anymore. But the board is one voice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is why one of the things I always recommend to a school board and to principals when I'm doing the training, I'm still a little old-fashioned this way, where I like 3-ring binders. And I say, in a 3-ring binder, every board member should have this. If you want to go to Google Docs these days, that's fine too. But in there should be the job description of a board member. It should be the job description of a principal as a reminder of that. It should be the bylaws. It should be some type of board training manual or PowerPoint like this, mm-hmm. or something. Anything else that you would?
Well, I think that's important to have that. If they have a constitution, mm-hmm. I think if they develop a strategic plan, that should be in the binder. Mm-hmm. When the board develops policies, the principal will develop a procedure. For example, you might have a policy that all tuition, your tuition is due on the 15th and it's to be paid. That's the policy. What happens if it's not paid? Well, the board doesn't decide that. The principal comes up with a procedure, presents it to the board, and then I think those procedures can also be in there so that there's a clear path of what happens. I think then the board can say to the principal, are you following the procedure you developed? Mm-hmm. And that's fair to do.
Yes, in fact, we talked about that. One of the things I always say is it's like a playing field. Let's say it's a football field, and the principal has the ability to go within sideline to sideline, and that's the procedure.
Right.
The policy is, here's
right.
the field of play, and here's the out of bounds. And I'm right with you on that yellow box being very important. No matter what the vote is, and it could be a 4-3 vote.
4-3 vote.
It's still, you walk out of there, this is the decision of the school board. What does a lot of harm to school ministry is when people walk out and then they start saying, well, I didn't vote yes on that, or I voted against that, or this isn't over, that kind of thing. There's a lot of disruption. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
I've seen it.
I've seen it too, way too many times. And I always think that this is a good reminder. Be enthusiastic. You're an advocate of the school. You are a head cheerleader. So when you go out and you're standing at the fence at a game and somebody's coming up complaining, to me, a great response is, isn't this a great game? Look at the stands. Look at the people here. Look at how our students are doing so many wonderful things. So figure out, and sometimes this is a board discussion. How do we do that? How do we engage in an enthusiastic way? Let's sample a little bit, so we have some lines to come up with. And as a principal, I always felt, one of my jobs was to give the board positive things to talk about. So when you are captured in the, out in the parking lot and negative things are going on, that this board member has 5-6 positive things that they can talk about that are going on at the school.
Very important.
Yeah. And being informed, devoting the necessary time for board activities. And again, it's a responsibility to be on a board. It's not, I'm going to show up every now and then. No, you have to be engaged. You have to be at the board meetings. You have to read your material ahead of time. Think of good questions to ask. Be involved. Commitment to the school's mission, as Bill said, that mission statement, that's the driving force.
Right.
And make decisions based on understanding. In board discussions, remain confidential. And that's the other big thing. And I see where this is a challenge sometimes, because I'm a parent and I'm on the board, and other parents are asking me what happened at the board meeting, especially if there's a big event or something that's going on with personnel or discipline issues or something like that. They will capture you at some point in time and want to know.
Some of these things are harder in a smaller setting because everybody knows everybody, and it's even an issue where everybody's related to everybody.
Yeah,
and that can get to be an issue as well.
And while we're on the topic of evaluations, we talked about evaluating the principal being held accountable to evaluate educators, the teachers at the school, the other personnel. Board members should be responsible to evaluate one another and themselves.
That's correct.
And they should do that on an annual basis. I always say the veteran board members should be rating how the board has operated because they have knowledge. New board members rating how the board should operate, thinking, okay, I'm new here. This is how I believe it should be happening. And they should use some type of instrument out there that helps them with the understanding of the effectiveness of a board. And there are instruments that are out there to evaluate board members.
Well, and one good instrument they'll have in their notebook, are we following our policies?
Yes, yeah. And the other thing, how many meetings have you shown up to? If you have, and I always like 6 meetings a year. Some places still do it monthly, but how many of those have you attended? Have you been engaged? Have you asked questions? Were you prepared ahead of time? Was the agenda done ahead of time? All these are things that are healthy to talk about so you can have effective meetings.
A good board will have a policy about how many meetings you can miss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you miss too many,
you're gone.
And I always say that's the job of the principal and the job of the board chair to then sit down with that individual and say, being on the board is not right for you. Can we keep you engaged in some other way? Right? Is there a committee you could be on? Is there something else that you could do? Because you don't want to lose the person.
No, you don't.
But the board's just not the right place for you to use your talents and time. One of the other things that I'm going to throw your way here that has come up, and this comes up all the time, every year, questions about who can attend a board meeting. So what they're really talking about is an open session of a board meeting. A lot of places think public school, they think sunshine law, all these things. They see a public school board sitting up front with a huge desk and everything, and then people in the audience attending a meeting. And what's the difference between an open session and an executive session?
Well, I think a good rule of thumb to follow would be is if somebody wants to come to the board, you can allow them to come for a set amount of time. A good rule of thumb on that is to say, all right, we're gonna let you come for the first 15 minutes. You can say what you want to say. We are not going to discuss it with you, but you can tell us what it is, and then I would excuse them to go on their way. If it's not on the agenda, you're probably not going to discuss it in that meeting, but you might discuss it in the next one, unless it's like, again, an emergency type of thing. So I don't think it's wrong to have people come, but I don't think it's right to have people be there for a whole board meeting. And it's never a good idea, I think, to have people there that are not part of the board, and then you go into executive session. Especially if you have teachers there. Well, why am I not good enough to hear about? Are they going to talk about me? So I think you should set a time limit to say, we're going to let you come. If our meeting starts at 7, you can come from 7 to 7:15. If you want to say what you want to say it, and we'll be happy to listen to it. But then you need to leave at 7:15. Some people will be upset enough they'll want to challenge you to do it, and I think then you need to say, well, we're going to need to have another meeting with you, with either a small group of the board or the board and the principal or the board and the pastor or whomever that would need to deal with it. But board meetings are for board business. They're not parties.
Yeah, and when I talk with boards and they have somebody come in, if the first 15 minutes, I think that's a great idea. I always say limit the time. I know in some places you have 3 minutes per individual, and then once your 3 minutes are up, it's up. In terms of if there's a real issue that you have and you want to bring it to the board, I always say, well, you need a policy. All this should be in your policy. So this should be in your student parent handbook. Parents should be able to see what your policy is for board meetings. And if it really is an issue, well, what I like is a policy. Submit it to the principal ahead of time in writing, what it is that you would like to bring to the board. The principal will then share that with the board chair. The board chair will then return to that individual and say that it's on the meeting's agenda. And I always say give them, I like 10 minutes because I think it's enough time to say what you need. It's not so long that it becomes a gripe session kind of thing. However, I advise schools, when that's the case, let the individual know that it will be in executive session that issue will be brought up, because that way you avoid any rumble in the audience, and all of a sudden this person is trying to play the crowd, and then you have people who basically are chiming in and shouldn't be chiming in. The last thing you want to do in a board meeting is lose control.
Especially if it's your brother, your sister, or your wife.
Yeah. Yes.
Or husband that's upset. So
yes,
again, I think that's good to have a policy on how we're going to deal with those issues and follow it.
Yeah, and I always, in that circumstance, and in the one that Bill's talking about too, setting, let's say, 15 minutes ahead of time, let people address the board. One of the big things the board has to get in the habit of is not to engage in conversation. And that's
correct.
Hard because, somebody will say something and a board member will, that's not true, that's not really what happened. And now you've been baited into engagement, and that is not anything that's healthy, nor will it go anywhere that's healthy. Then you talk about a downward spiral. That's the way to start it.
That's so true.
And the same thing, if there really is an issue, and the person gets 10 minutes, it's executive session. The board needs to learn, sit there, listen, do not respond at the time, but as part of your policy, note that the board chair will provide you a written response within 10 days as to what the board will do to handle it. And typically what the board does to handle an issue like that, if it wasn't a violation of a policy, pretty much what the board's decision is going to be is, we very much appreciate you coming before the board and discussing this issue with us.
It's not ours to handle.
Yeah, we've taken it under consideration, and this is something that was the principal's to deal with.
Yeah, I think actually if you can get the Matthew 18 principle in place, you will have very little of that stuff happening at the board level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And again, it goes back, board, Bill, you've hit on this time and time again during our discussion here, board training.
Board training, right.
And to do it every year if possible, but you do not want to go a long time without board training. And that also means onboarding of new board members. Right away in August, I always say, you should, when the new board members are elected, that's why I select the three-ring binder. You hand them over the binder, right, and you say, here you go, here's your homework for the very first meeting in August. And in August, we're going to talk about our board manual, all the documents that are in there, the employee handbook, the bylaws, the Constitution, how we run board meetings, that it's a 90-minute meeting, here are all the things with it. So really it's the nuts and bolts of how everything's going to be handled for that year. And that is so important.
I think you have a slide on there that shows the board manual resource.
I do, yeah, right at the beginning, on Lutheran.
That's on Lutheran. This is updated, and it's a good resource for schools to use.
And free.
And it's free. Download it. And a lot of the things we've talked about are in there. I think there's some things that are not in there that we've talked about that are important. But the training is the biggest thing. And some schools will be policy-based governance, which is more the Carver model. Some schools will be the traditional policy-based board, where they set policy and do that. So, but this is a good resource to use.
Yeah.
And there are others that are out there on. There's some board evaluation tools. They used to be on the portal site. I think they're going to put them back on. Not Al has them that you can use also.
Yeah, and I'm with Bill. I think this is a great resource. Like Bill said, it's just updated. I always point out pages 15 to 16, as you see there, the school board development plan. Again, I like rolling that out in August to talk about how are we going to improve as a board, how do we engage one another, how do we engage the school. Great resource, a lot of check boxes in that. It also has different information in there in terms of resources for principals and job descriptions for principals and other roles in the school. So I would download this. I would put it in a 3-ring binder, right, and hand out to the board members and make sure they have that every year. And they bring it to every meeting. So you can use it and refer back to it.
I think the other important resource for principals to keep in mind is your district education executive, who, when you have a question about something, that's a safe person to call, to ask the question about, to get some advice, to maybe even get some help, maybe even to come and visit. It's a good tool to use. That's why the district executive is here, is to help your school.
Absolutely, yeah. We're here to serve and to do what we can to help you out in any possible way. We want you to be successful. We want our ministries to flourish. With that, I will ask if there are any questions. We hit the mark here at just about 7:30. We'll see if anyone has anything they'd like to comment on or shoot us in terms of a question. If not, what I'm going to do is ask Bill to close us in prayer then.
Okay. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we come to you and thank you for the many blessings that you give us. Certainly one of those blessings are our Lutheran schools, where we have the opportunity to share every day with our students that Jesus Christ died and rose for their sins, and that they believe in him, they have eternal life. We thank you for the Lutheran schools that we have, for the administrators, teachers, and board members that serve those schools. We want our schools to be the best they can be to further your kingdom. Be with them and bless them in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. A great big thank you to Bill for joining us and
Honored to be here.
presenting. He does a great job, and it sounds like he'll be back for a couple additional ones.
Well, maybe
he brought
so,
up other
yeah.
topics. So, blessings on your evening.
Have a good
Take
night.
care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stop the share. Get out of there. Try to get,
That H10 board presentation, that's a good one. Summermeyer
I saw
developed
that
that.
one. I like that one. I like the 10. Yeah.
He developed that one. That was a good one. He let me use it.
Yeah, those are excellent.
The other individual